The sun hung low in the sky, painting the upscale Oak Hills neighborhood in golden light. The tree-lined streets with their perfectly manicured lawns seemed to glow, giving the whole area a picture-perfect quality that real estate agents love to showcase. It was the kind of neighborhood where people paid extra for peace of mind, where the homeowners association had strict rules about everything from fence heights to acceptable shades of exterior paint. Thomas Wilson stood in his driveway, hosing down his new SUV. At 46, Thomas had worked hard to afford this lifestyle. He'd climbed the corporate ladder at an insurance firm, putting in 60-hour weeks to earn his place in this community. In his mind, he'd earned the right to enjoy the quiet, orderly environment he paid so much to live in. As water ran down the gleaming black paint of his vehicle, Thomas noticed someone walking down the street, someone he didn't recognize. It was a teenage girl, maybe 14 or 15, with dark skin and curly hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She wore simple jeans and a blue t-shirt, carrying a stack of books that looked heavy enough to make her adjust her grip every few steps. Thomas frowned, turning off the hose. In the 3 years he'd lived here, he'd come to recognize most of the families on this side of the neighborhood. He took pride in knowing who belonged and who didn't. It was part of what neighbors did to keep watch, he believed. "Excuse me," he called out, setting the hose down and walking toward the sidewalk. "Can I help you with something?" The girl looked up, slightly startled. She hadn't noticed him until he spoke. "No thanks, I'm good," she replied with a polite smile, continuing to walk. Thomas stepped further into her path. "I don't think I've seen you around here before. Do you live nearby?" His tone was friendly enough, but there was an edge to his question. The girl stopped walking, shifting the weight of her books to her other arm. "I live on Maple Street," she answered. "I'm just taking a shortcut home from the library. These books are getting heavy." Thomas knew Maple Street. It was in the older part of the development where the houses were smaller and more affordable. Not quite the same as this section with its larger lots and custom homes. "That's quite away from here," he said, crossing his arms. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, clearly becoming uncomfortable. "I'm Zoe," she finally said. "Look, I'm just walking home. The main road adds like 10 extra minutes and these books are really heavy." "Well, Zoe, this is a private community," Thomas said, which wasn't entirely true. The streets were public, though many residents liked to pretend otherwise. "We've had some issues with break-ins lately." This was also not true, but Thomas had seen a post on the Neighborhood Watch app about suspicious activity 2 neighborhoods over. "I'm just walking through," Zoe replied, her voice still polite but with growing tension. "I'm not bothering anyone. I use this shortcut all the time." "All the time?" Thomas raised his eyebrows. "So you're regularly cutting through our neighborhood?" A car drove by slowly, the driver glancing curiously at them before continuing on. Thomas gave a neighborly wave as if to signal everything was under control. "It's a public street," Zoe said, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The stack of books, advanced science topics Thomas now noticed, looked heavier by the minute. "I'm sorry, but I need to get home. My mom is expecting me." "Where did you get those books?" Thomas asked, ignoring her attempt to end the conversation. Zoe took a deep breath, clearly trying to stay patient. "From the public library. I'm doing research for my science project on quantum physics." "The library, huh?" Thomas looked skeptical. "And they let you check out that many books?" "Yes," Zoe replied simply. "I have a library card." Thomas pulled out his phone. "You know what? I think I'm going to call someone to make sure everything's okay here." "Just to be safe, are you serious?" Zoe asked, her composure finally breaking. "You're calling the police because I'm walking home with library books?" "I'm just being cautious," Thomas replied, already dialing. "If everything's fine, then you have nothing to worry about." He turned slightly away from her as the call connected. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in the Oak Hills neighborhood," he said into the phone. "There's a teenage girl who doesn't live here walking through our community. No, she says she's just passing through, but we've had concerns about security lately. Corner of Oakwood and Pine. Thank you." He ended the call and turned back to Zoe. "They're sending someone over just to check things out." Zoe's eyes widened with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You really just called the police on me for walking home?" "It's not a big deal if you're telling the truth," Thomas replied. "The officer will just verify your information and make sure everything's on the up and up." "This is ridiculous," Zoe said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm 14 years old. I'm carrying library books. I'm just trying to get home, Thomas shrugged. Well, now you'll need to wait for the officer. Zoe stood there, books still in her arms, looking around as if hoping someone else might walk by and intervene. The sun was getting lower, casting longer shadows across the perfectly maintained lawns. What should have been a 15-minute walk from the library was turning into something much longer and more complicated. Can I at least sit down somewhere? She asked, nodding toward the heavy books in her arms. Thomas hesitated, then gestured toward the curb. You can wait there. Zoe carefully set her books down on the edge of the sidewalk and sat beside them, pulling out her phone. I'm texting my mom to let her know what's happening. That's fine, Thomas said, standing a few feet away, arms still crossed. He felt a flicker of doubt. She seemed like a regular kid with her science books and polite responses, but quickly pushed it aside. Better safe than sorry, he told himself. He was just looking out for his community. 10 minutes passed in awkward silence. Zoe sent several text messages, her fingers tapping rapidly on her phone screen. Thomas remained standing, occasionally glancing up and down the street for the police car. Neighbors driving by slowed down to look, and Thomas gave them reassuring nods. Finally, a police cruiser turned onto the street, rolling slowly toward them. Officer Reynolds, a middle-aged man with a trim build, stepped out of the vehicle and approached them. Good evening, he said. I received a call about a suspicious person. Yes, officer, Thomas said, stepping forward and lowering his voice slightly. I found this girl walking through our neighborhood. She doesn't live here, and when I asked what she was doing, her story seemed a bit off. Officer Reynolds looked at Zoe, still sitting on the curb with her stack of books. Hello there. Mind if I ask what's going on? Zoe stood up, leaving her books on the ground. I'm walking home from the library, she explained calmly, though her hands were trembling slightly. I live on Maple Street. I was taking a shortcut through this neighborhood because it's faster than going around and my books are heavy. She gestured toward the stack. This man stopped me and said I wasn't allowed to walk here, then called you. Officer Reynolds looked at the books. Those for school? Yes, sir, Zoe replied. I'm working on a science project about quantum physics. I want to be a physicist someday. The officer nodded, then turned to Thomas. Sir, did you see this young lady doing anything concerning other than walking through the neighborhood? Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Well, no, but we don't know everyone who belongs here, and with security concerns these days. I understand community vigilance, Officer Reynolds said, but walking on a public street with library books isn't suspicious activity. He turned back to Zoe. Do you have ID with you? Just my school ID and library card, she said, pulling them from her pocket. The officer glanced at them briefly. Zoe Williams, Franklin Middle School? Yes, sir. And you said you live on Maple Street? What number? 425 Maple, Zoe answered. The blue house with white trim. Officer Reynolds nodded, recognizing the address. I know that area. Your mom home? Yes, Zoe said. I texted her about what was happening. She said she's on her way. As if on cue, a sleek black car turned sharply onto the street, driving toward them with purpose. It pulled up behind the police cruiser and a woman stepped out. She wore a tailored suit, her hair pulled back in a bun similar to Zoe's ponytail. Her expression was calm but intense as she walked briskly toward the group. Thomas watched her approach, already feeling that something had gone very wrong with his plan to protect the neighborhood. There was an air of authority about this woman that made him suddenly wish he'd minded his own business. Officer Reynolds turned toward the approaching woman, his posture straightening slightly as recognition flickered across his face. Ms. Williams, he said with a nod that carried unmistakable respect. Officer Reynolds, she replied, her voice steady and controlled. I understand someone called the police on my daughter for walking home with library books. Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he realized just how badly he might have misjudged the situation. The atmosphere changed the moment Zoe's mother stepped onto the scene. Her presence brought a new tension to the quiet suburban street, not the nervous, defensive kind that had existed between Thomas and Zoe, but something more purposeful and direct. I'm Diane Williams, she said, placing a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder while extending the other toward Officer Reynolds. She didn't offer her hand to Thomas. Would someone please explain why my daughter was detained on her way home from the library? Thomas cleared his throat. No one was detained, he said quickly. I was just asking some questions about why she was in our neighborhood. Diane's gaze shifted to Thomas, her eyes narrowing slightly. And you are? Thomas Wilson. I live right here. He gestured toward his house with its perfectly trimmed hedges and freshly washed SUV in the driveway. I was just being cautious. We look out for each other around here. Officer Reynolds stepped in, his tone professional but careful. Mr. Wilson called about someone he considered suspicious walking through the neighborhood. When I arrived, I found your daughter with her library books, and we were just sorting things out. Diane nodded slowly, taking this in. I see. And what exactly was suspicious about my daughter walking home with books? Thomas shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The confidence he'd felt earlier was evaporating under Diane's steady gaze. Well, I didn't recognize her, and we've had some concerns about security in the area recently. Have there been specific incidents in this neighborhood? Diane asked, looking between Thomas and Officer Reynolds. The officer shook his head. Nothing reported recently in Oak Hills specifically. There was a car break-in about 2 miles from here last month, but nothing in this immediate area. Thomas felt his justification weakening. Well, it pays to be vigilant these days. Vigilant, Diane repeated the word carefully. Is that what you call stopping a 14-year-old honor student who's carrying library books? Calling the police on her for walking on a public street? Zoe touched her mother's arm gently. Mom, it's okay. I just want to go home. Diane squeezed her daughter's shoulder. I know, honey, we will. But this is important. She turned her attention back to Thomas. Mr. Wilson, may I ask, do you stop everyone who walks through this neighborhood that you don't recognize? Do you question all strangers who pass by your house? Thomas felt heat rising in his face. I use my judgment. When something doesn't look right, Diane cut in, her voice remaining even. Or when someone doesn't look right. The implication hung in the air. A car drove by slowly, the driver openly staring at the small gathering on the sidewalk. Now wait a minute. Thomas raised his hand defensively. This has nothing to do with how anyone looks. This is about neighborhood safety. Officer Reynolds looked increasingly uncomfortable. He'd been on the force for 15 years and had seen this scenario play out before. Ms. Williams, I understand your concern. I can assure you that we responded to assess the situation, as we do with any call. Your daughter has done nothing wrong. I appreciate that, Officer Reynolds, Diane said, but I'm concerned about the reason for the call in the first place. She turned back to Thomas. Mr. Wilson, do you realize what could have happened here today? Do you understand how quickly situations like this can escalate? Thomas crossed his arms. I think you're blowing this out of proportion. I was just asking some questions, and then I called for an officer to check things out. It's what good neighbors do. Good neighbors, Diane echoed, shaking her head slightly. Let me tell you what good neighbors in my community do. They learn each other's names. They wave when kids walk by. They offer help when someone is carrying something heavy. They don't automatically assume the worst about a child passing through. Zoe, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, spoke up. I walk this way at least twice a week, Mr. Wilson. I've been doing it all school year. Other people in these houses wave to me sometimes. Thomas looked genuinely surprised at this information. I've never seen you before. That doesn't mean I haven't been here, Zoe replied quietly. Officer Reynolds decided to move things toward resolution. Ms. Williams, is there anything else you need from us today? I'm satisfied that there's no issue here requiring police attention. Just one moment, Diane said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a business card and handed it to the officer. For your report. Officer Reynolds glanced at the card and his posture straightened almost imperceptibly. Thomas, noticing the change, felt another wave of unease. Yes, ma'am, the officer said, tucking the card into his pocket. I'll make sure everything is properly documented. Thomas tried to get a glimpse of the card but couldn't make out what was on it. Whatever it was, it had clearly shifted something in the dynamic. What's going on? He asked, looking between them. Diane turned to him. Mr. Wilson, I work as a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I specialize in civil rights cases. The color drained from Thomas's face. I didn't know that. Why would you? Diane replied evenly. You didn't know anything about my daughter either, but that didn't stop you from making assumptions and calling the police. A second police car pulled up behind the first one. An officer stepped out and approached the group, nodding respectfully to Officer Reynolds. Everything okay here, Reynolds? The new officer asked, surveying the scene. Yes, Officer Chen, Reynolds replied. Just wrapping up. This is Ms. Williams and her daughter. He didn't elaborate further, but something in his tone made Officer Chen glance more carefully at Diane. Ms. Williams. Chen nodded. Nice to see you again. You as well, Officer Chen, Diane replied. Thomas looked between them, the realization dawning that Diane Williams was someone these officers knew professionally. The ground beneath his righteous indignation was crumbling rapidly. Look, he said, trying to regain some control of the situation. I think we've had a misunderstanding. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. No harm intended. Intentions and impact are different things, Mr. Wilson, Diane said. The impact today was that my daughter was stopped, questioned, made to wait for the police, and made to feel like she doesn't belong in this community, all because she was walking home from the library. Zoe had been carefully repacking her books into a more manageable stack. Mom, these are getting heavy. Can we go now? Diane nodded. Of course, she turned to the officers. Thank you both for your professionalism today. I trust this incident will be thoroughly documented. Yes, ma'am. Both officers replied almost in unison. Officer Reynolds turned to Thomas. Mr. Wilson, in the future, please consider whether a situation truly requires police response. We're always here when needed, but calls like this, he paused, choosing his words carefully. They can take resources away from genuine emergencies. Thomas nodded stiffly, aware that several neighbors had now come out onto their porches, watching the scene unfold. This wasn't how he'd imagined this situation playing out. In his mind, he'd been the vigilant community member, the one keeping watch. Now he felt exposed, his judgment called into question in front of his neighbors. Officer Chen helped Zoe with her books, carrying half the stack to her mother's car. That's quite a load of books. What are you studying? Quantum physics, Zoe replied. I'm doing a project on how quantum entanglement might eventually impact computing. Officer Chen raised his eyebrows, impressed. That's way beyond what I was doing at 14. Good for you. Diane opened the passenger door for her daughter, then turned back to face Thomas one last time. Mr. Wilson, I hope you'll think about what happened here today. My daughter deserves to walk through this community, any community, without being treated with suspicion because of how she looks. Thomas started to protest, but the words died in his throat. He wasn't a bad person, he told himself. He hadn't meant any harm. He was just being cautious. I'm sorry if I overreacted, he finally managed, though the apology felt insufficient even to his own ears. Diane studied him for a moment. I appreciate that. But I think your apology belongs to Zoe, not to me. Thomas turned to the teenager who was now sitting in the passenger seat, window rolled down. I'm sorry for the trouble, he said stiffly. Zoe looked at him for a long moment. I'm here all the time, Mr. Wilson. Maybe next time you could just wave. With that simple statement, Thomas felt something shift in his perspective. The simplicity of her suggestion, just wave, made all his suspicions and fears seem overblown. What would it have cost him to simply wave at a passing teenager instead of turning the moment into this? As Diane drove away with Zoe, the two police officers returned to their respective vehicles. Officer Reynolds paused beside Thomas. Word of advice, he said quietly. Ms. Williams doesn't make idle threats, but she does believe in education and community solutions before legal action. I'd take this as a learning opportunity. Thomas nodded silently, watching as the police cars pulled away one after another. He was left standing alone on his driveway, uncomfortably aware of the neighbors who had witnessed the entire scene. The garden hose still lay where he'd dropped it, water pooling on the concrete. As he bent to pick it up, he noticed a library book on the ground, one of Zoe's that must have fallen during the commotion. He picked it up, reading the title, The Universe and Beyond, Modern Theories of Quantum Physics. Thomas stared at the book, the weight of it in his hands suddenly feeling much heavier than its physical mass. He hadn't recognized Zoe because he hadn't been looking, and now he couldn't help but wonder what else and who else he'd been failing to. See? Thomas stood in his kitchen the next morning, coffee cup in hand, staring out the window without really seeing anything. The events of the previous day kept replaying in his mind. He'd slept poorly, waking up several times with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd made a serious mistake. The library book still sat on his counter where he'd placed it last night, a physical reminder of the encounter. His wife, Beth, walked into the kitchen and immediately noticed his distracted expression. "You're up early. Everything okay?" Thomas hesitated. He hadn't told her about yesterday's incident when she'd come home from her shift at the hospital. Somehow putting it into words had seemed too difficult. "I think I messed up," he finally said, turning to face her. "I called the police on a kid yesterday." Beth's eyebrows shot up. "You did what? Why?" Thomas explained what had happened, trying to be honest about the sequence of events while also defending his initial concerns. As he spoke, Beth's expression shifted from surprise to disappointment. "Oh, Thomas," she sighed when he finished. "You called the police on a teenage girl carrying library books?" "I didn't know who she was," he said defensively. "She could have been anyone." "She was a kid walking through the neighborhood," Beth replied. "And now you're telling me her mother is a federal prosecutor? Who specializes in civil rights cases?" She shook her head. "This could get complicated." "I know," Thomas admitted. "I've been thinking about it all night. I need to return this book to her, but I'm not sure how to approach it." Beth took a sip of her coffee. "You need to apologize. A real apology, not just sorry for the trouble." "I did apologize," Thomas protested. "Did you?" Beth challenged. "Or did you just try to justify your actions?" The question hung in the air between them. Thomas thought back to his stiff, reluctant, "Sorry if I overreacted," and felt a twinge of shame. "I think I know where she lives," he said finally. "She mentioned Maple Street," Beth nodded. "That's a start. But think about how you're going to approach this. After what happened, just showing up at their door might not be the best idea." Thomas hadn't considered that. The thought of driving to their house suddenly seemed inappropriate, even threatening. "You're right. Maybe I should write a note and leave it with the book in their mailbox." "That's better," Beth agreed. "But make sure the note is sincere. Don't make excuses." Thomas nodded, already dreading the task ahead. Writing wasn't his strong suit, especially when it came to admitting he was wrong. Across town, Zoe sat at the kitchen table with her mother, organizing her notes for the science project. The quantum physics books were spread out around her, minus one that had gone missing during yesterday's confrontation. "I really need that book," Zoe said with a frown. It had the best explanation of entanglement. Diane looked up from her laptop where she was reviewing case files. "We can get another copy from the library, or I can order it online if you need it right away." "It's not just that," Zoe said. "All my notes from those chapters are color-coded to the book pages. It'll take forever to redo them." Diane studied her daughter's face. "How are you feeling about yesterday?" Zoe shrugged, trying to appear casual. "It's not like it was the first time something like that happened." "I know," Diane said gently. "But that doesn't make it okay." "I'm fine." "Mom, really?" Zoe turned back to her notes, but Diane could see the tension in her shoulders. "You know," Diane said, closing her laptop, "it's okay to be upset about it." "I'm upset about it." Zoe looked up. "You didn't seem upset. You were so calm." "Professional calm," Diane corrected. "Trust me, inside I was furious. No one gets to make my daughter feel like she doesn't belong somewhere." Zoe was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he would have called the police if I looked different?" The question hung in the air between them. It wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation, but each instance still carried weight. "I don't know what was in his mind," Diane answered carefully. "But I do know that people make split-second judgments based on appearance all the time. It's my job to address those situations when they cross the line." "Are you going to sue him?" Zoe asked, her eyes widening slightly. Diane smiled. "No, honey. Not every situation requires legal action. Sometimes education is more effective than punishment." The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Diane went to answer it, Zoe trailing behind her curiously. When she opened the door, no one was there. Instead, a package sat on the doorstep with a handwritten note attached. Diane picked it up and brought it inside. "It's your missing book," she said, handing it to Zoe. With a note. Zoe took the note and read it aloud. "To Zoe and Ms. Williams, I found this book after you left yesterday and wanted to return it. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I want to apologize sincerely for my actions. There was no justification for how I treated Zoe. Everyone deserves to feel safe walking through any neighborhood, and I failed to remember that yesterday. I'm sorry for the distress I caused. If there's a way I can make amends, please let me know. Respectfully, Thomas Wilson." He'd included his phone number at the bottom of the note. Diane and Zoe exchanged looks. Well, Diane said. That's more thoughtful than I expected. Zoe examined her book. At least he didn't damage it. She flipped through the pages and found something tucked inside, a gift card to the local bookstore for $50. He didn't need to do that, Zoe said, showing it to her mother. Diane took the gift card, considering it. No, he didn't, but it suggests he's genuinely trying to make things right. Should we call him? Zoe asked. Diane handed the gift card back. That's up to you, honey. You don't owe him anything, including forgiveness or a response. Zoe thought about it. I think I want to talk to him. Not alone, she added quickly, seeing her mother's expression. But maybe this could be a chance to help him understand. Diane couldn't help but feel proud of her daughter's maturity. At 14, Zoe already understood something many adults never grasped. That change often required conversation, not just confrontation, if that's what you want. We can call him together, Diane agreed. Thomas was washing dishes when his phone rang. Seeing an unfamiliar number, he almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. Hello, Mr. Wilson? This is Diane Williams, Zoe's mother. Thomas nearly dropped the phone. Miss Williams, thank you for calling. Did you get the book and my note? We did, Diane replied. Her tone was professional but not cold. Zoe would like to speak with you if you're willing. Of course, Thomas said, surprised. He hadn't expected them to want any further contact with him. There was a pause, and then Zoe's voice came on the line. Hi, Mr. Wilson. Hello, Zoe, Thomas replied, feeling strangely nervous talking to a teenager. Thank you for calling. Thank you for returning my book, Zoe said. And for the gift card. You didn't have to do that. It seemed like the least I could do, Thomas replied. I'm truly sorry about yesterday. I was wrong. There was a brief silence before Zoe spoke again. I was thinking, our school is having a community forum next week about building bridges between neighborhoods. Would you want to come? You could meet some of the other kids who live on my street. Thomas hadn't expected this turn in the conversation. The invitation caught him off guard. A community forum? Mom's one of the speakers, Zoe explained. It's about how different parts of town can work together better. After what happened, I thought maybe. Yes, Thomas said quickly before he could overthink it. I'd like to come. That's very thoughtful of you to invite me. Cool, Zoe said. It's Wednesday at 7 p.m. at Franklin Middle School. In the auditorium. I'll be there, Thomas promised. After a few more moments of conversation, they said goodbye. Thomas stood in his kitchen, phone still in hand, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Shame was still there, but alongside it was something unexpected. Hope. The girl he had viewed with suspicion less than 24 hours ago had just extended an olive branch he knew he didn't deserve. Beth came into the kitchen and saw his expression. Who was that? Zoe and her mother, Thomas replied, still processing what had just happened. They got my note and Zoe invited me to a community forum at her school next week. Beth's eyebrows rose. And you're going? Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, I think I need to. Good, Beth said simply. She started to walk away, then turned back. You know, this could have gone very differently. You're lucky they're willing to see it as a learning opportunity. I know, Thomas agreed. I just hope I can learn the right lessons from it. Beth smiled slightly. That's a good start. As she left the room, Thomas picked up his coffee mug and looked out the window again. This time he actually saw the neighborhood. The houses, the trees, the sidewalks where people walked. The same streets, but somehow they looked different now. He wondered how many other things he'd been looking at without really seeing. The community forum was 6 days away. Thomas made a note on the calendar, circling the date. For the first time in a long while, he was going to step outside his comfort zone, not out of obligation, but because a 14-year-old girl had shown more maturity and grace than he had. The least he could do was show up and listen. Wednesday evening arrived more quickly than Thomas had anticipated. He stood in front of his closet, unusually indecisive about what to wear to the community forum. A suit seemed too formal, but jeans felt too casual. He finally settled on khaki pants and a blue button-down shirt, presentable but not trying too hard. You're overthinking this, Beth said from the doorway, watching him change his shirt for the third time. I want to make the right impression, Thomas replied. Beth leaned against the doorframe. Just be genuine. That's the best impression you can make. Thomas nodded, though his stomach was still in knots. Over the past 6 days, he'd thought constantly about the upcoming forum. He'd even done something he rarely did: research. He'd read articles about community policing, racial profiling, and the concept of belonging. The more he read, the more he realized how much he didn't know. "Do you want me to come with you?" Beth asked. Thomas considered it. Having his wife there would make him feel more comfortable, but he shook his head. "I think this is something I need to do on my own." 20 minutes later, Thomas pulled into the parking lot of Franklin Middle School. The lot was nearly full, surprising him. He'd expected a small gathering, not what appeared to be a major event. Families streamed toward the entrance, many greeting each other warmly. Thomas walked alone, feeling increasingly out of place. Inside the auditorium, rows of chairs faced a stage with a podium and microphones. A banner hung overhead reading, "Building Bridges, One Community, Many Neighborhoods." People chatted in clusters while children darted between seats. Thomas scanned the crowd, recognizing no one. "Mr. Wilson," he turned to see Zoe approaching, waving at him. She wore a blue dress with a cardigan, looking more grown up than she had in her casual clothes last week. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I said I would," Thomas replied, relieved to see a familiar face. "Thank you again for inviting me." "Come meet my friends," Zoe said, gesturing for him to follow. She led him to a group of teenagers near the front of the auditorium. "Guys, this is Mr. Wilson from Oak Hills. Mr. Wilson, these are my friends from the science club." Thomas greeted them awkwardly, aware that Zoe had not mentioned the circumstances of their meeting. The teens, absorbed in their own conversations, barely registered his presence before turning back to each other. "They're excited about the robot competition next month," Zoe explained. "We've been building an autonomous rover that can navigate obstacles." Thomas nodded, impressed despite himself. "That sounds advanced for middle school." "We have a great science teacher," Zoe replied with a shrug. "Oh, there's my mom. She needs to get ready for her speech. Do you want to sit with us? We're in the 3rd row." Before Thomas could answer, Zoe was leading him to a row of seats where an older woman sat reading a program. "Grandma, this is Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson." "This is my grandmother." The older woman looked up, studying Thomas with sharp eyes that reminded him of Diane's. "Ah, you're the man from Oak Hills." Thomas swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." She said, neither friendly nor hostile. "Zoe tells me you've had a change of heart." "I'm trying," Thomas admitted. She nodded as if his answer satisfied her. "That's all any of us can do. Have a seat." Thomas sat down beside her, Zoe on his other side. He felt strangely like he was being chaperoned. "My daughter has always been one to build bridges rather than walls," Zoe's grandmother said quietly. "Even as a child, she brought people together." "Zoe takes after her." Thomas nodded, uncertain how to respond. He was saved from having to figure it out when the lights dimmed, and a man stepped up to the podium. "Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our community forum on building stronger connections between neighborhoods. I'm Principal Taylor, and I'm thrilled to see such a great turnout tonight." The audience applauded, and Thomas found himself automatically joining in. "Our first speaker tonight is someone many of you know both as a parent at our school and as a dedicated public servant. Please welcome Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Williams." The applause grew louder as Diane walked onto the stage. She wore a simple but elegant navy suit, her hair pulled back. She carried herself with the same quiet confidence Thomas had noticed during their first encounter. But tonight there was warmth in her expression as she surveyed the crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began. "When we talk about community, we often focus on what divides us. Different incomes, different backgrounds, different neighborhoods. But true community isn't about sameness. It's about belonging despite our differences." Thomas listened intently as Diane spoke about how communities thrive when they embrace diversity rather than fear it. She didn't speak in legal terms or statistics, but in stories, about children who felt unwelcome in certain spaces, about elderly residents who felt forgotten, about newcomers struggling to find acceptance. "The neighborhoods in our town have invisible borders," she continued, "lines that some people cross easily while others are stopped and questioned. These aren't legal boundaries. They're boundaries of perception. Who looks like they belong? Who doesn't? And who gets to decide?" Thomas felt a rush of heat in his face, knowing she was describing exactly what he had done. Yet her tone wasn't accusatory. She was speaking to everyone, not singling him out. "Last week," Diane said, her voice becoming more personal. My daughter was stopped and questioned for walking through a neighborhood where someone decided she didn't belong. The police were called. It was upsetting and humiliating for her. A murmur went through the audience. Thomas stared straight ahead, feeling eyes turning toward him, though no one except Zoe and her family knew he was the person Diane was describing. But something unexpected happened afterward. Diane continued. The person who called the police reflected on his actions. He apologized, not with excuses, but with sincerity. And he accepted my daughter's invitation to be here tonight. Now people were definitely looking around, trying to identify the person she was talking about. Thomas fought the urge to sink lower in his seat. I'm not sharing this to embarrass anyone, Diane clarified. I'm sharing it because it's a perfect example of how we can turn moments of division into opportunities for growth. One incident handled differently could have led to anger and deeper division. Instead, it became a chance for understanding. Thomas felt Zoe's hand pat his arm briefly. When he glanced at her, she gave him an encouraging smile. This is the work we all need to do, Diane concluded. Not just reacting differently when incidents occur, but preventing them in the first place by truly seeing each other as neighbors, regardless of which street we live on. That's what tonight is about, building those connections before we need them, not just after something goes wrong. The audience applauded warmly as Diane stepped away from the podium. Several other speakers followed, including a police officer who talked about community-oriented policing, a high school student who shared her experiences moving between different neighborhoods, and an elderly man who described how isolated seniors often felt in changing communities. Throughout the presentations, Thomas found himself deeply engaged, occasionally glancing at Zoe and her grandmother to gauge their reactions. The teenager listened attentively, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. Her grandmother nodded at certain points as if the speakers were confirming things she had known all along. When the formal presentations ended, the principal invited everyone to continue conversations over refreshments in the cafeteria. People began to move about, forming new clusters of conversation. Will you stay for cookies? Zoe asked Thomas. Mom will be done talking to people soon. I'd like that, Thomas replied, surprised to find he genuinely meant it. In the cafeteria, Thomas stood awkwardly near the cookie table, plate in hand, watching the easy interactions around him. Students and parents from different neighborhoods mingled comfortably, many clearly familiar with each other despite living in different parts of town. It takes time, a voice said beside him. Thomas turned to find Diane had joined him, a cup of coffee in her hand. What does? He asked. Feeling comfortable in new spaces, she replied. I saw you listening carefully during the presentations. Thomas nodded. I learned a lot. Your speech it made me think. That's the goal, Diane said with a small smile. Thinking leads to change. I want you to know, Thomas said carefully, that what happened with Zoe, it's made me reconsider a lot of things. Not just that one incident, but how I've been viewing my community, my neighborhood. Diane studied him thoughtfully. That's a good start, Mr. Wilson. Thomas, please. Thomas, she acknowledged. You know, when Zoe told me she had invited you tonight, I was surprised. But she said everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow. She's wise beyond her years, Thomas said. She is, Diane agreed, clear pride in her voice. Though she shouldn't have to be. Children shouldn't have to develop wisdom about navigating other people's biases. The comment stung, but Thomas recognized its truth. No, they shouldn't. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Zoe laugh with her friends across the room. What happens now? Thomas finally asked. Diane turned back to him. That's largely up to you. Tonight doesn't fix everything, but it's a beginning. The question is, what will you do with what you've learned? It was a question Thomas had been asking himself all week, and standing here now, he was starting to see the outlines of an answer. 3 months had passed since the community forum. The maple trees lining Oak Hills were starting to change color, their green leaves giving way to brilliant reds and golds. Thomas sat on his front porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the crisp morning air. His Saturday routine had changed, in subtle but significant ways since that day, when he'd called the police on a teenage girl walking through his neighborhood. The sound of bicycle wheels on pavement caught his attention. He looked up to see a group of kids riding past his house, some from Oak Hills, others from neighboring areas including Maple Street. Among them was Zoe, who waved as they passed. Thomas waved back. the gesture now natural and automatic. Beth came out to join him, sitting in the adjacent chair with her own coffee. "The bike club?" she asked, watching the children pedal away. "Weekly Saturday ride," Thomas confirmed. "They're headed to the park for their science project. Something about collecting soil samples." Beth smiled. "It's nice to see kids from different neighborhoods getting together like that." "It is," Thomas agreed. He still felt a twinge of embarrassment when he remembered how he'd reacted to Zoe walking alone through Oak Hills. Now, children from all parts of town regularly passed his house, and he knew many of them by name. The neighborhood had changed, or perhaps more accurately, Thomas's perception of it had changed. After the community forum, he'd found himself noticing things he'd previously overlooked. The elderly Vietnamese couple who walked every evening, the Hispanic family that had moved in 3 doors down, the group of kids from various neighborhoods who met to ride bikes together on weekends. They had always been there. He just hadn't been looking. "Don't forget we have the neighborhood cookout this afternoon," Beth reminded him. "I remember," Thomas said. "I'm in charge of grills." The cookout had been his idea, proposed at the Homeowners Association meeting a month ago. Initially, some neighbors had been skeptical about opening their community park to residents from surrounding areas, but Thomas had been surprisingly persuasive. "It's not about opening our neighborhood," he'd explained. "It's about recognizing that we're all part of the same community. These artificial boundaries we create, they don't actually make us safer. They just make us more isolated." He'd spoken with a conviction that surprised even himself. In the end, the association had agreed to try it as a one-time event. Based on the RSVPs, today's cookout would bring together families from 5 different neighborhoods. Later that afternoon, Thomas stood at the grill in the community park, flipping burgers and keeping an eye on the hot dogs. Around him, the park had transformed into a bustling gathering. Children played soccer on the field while parents chatted in groups, many meeting for the first time despite living just blocks apart. "Need a hand?" a familiar voice asked. Thomas turned to find Officer Reynolds beside him, out of uniform in casual clothes. "Always," Thomas replied, handing him the spatula. "Thanks for coming." The officer took over the grill duties. "Wouldn't miss it. The department's community outreach coordinator is excited about what you're doing here." In the months following the incident with Zoe, Thomas had met several times with Officer Reynolds and other community officers. Their conversations had started awkwardly, but gradually evolved into productive discussions about neighborhood watch programs that built connections rather than suspicion. "How's the new training program going?" Thomas asked. Officer Reynolds nodded. "Good. We've had 75% of the force complete the community bridge building workshops. Your story, or I should say your and Zoe's story, has become something of a teaching moment." Thomas shook his head, still uncomfortable being held up as an example. "I'm just glad something positive came out of my mistake." "That's how we learn," Reynolds said simply. Across the park, Thomas spotted Diane Williams arriving with Zoe and her grandmother. He waved and they made their way over. "This is quite a turnout," Diane observed, looking around the park. "Your neighborhood association must be pleased." "Most of them," Thomas admitted with a small smile. "There are still a few who think we should keep to ourselves, but they're becoming the minority." Zoe had already spotted her friends and was asking permission to join them. "Go ahead," her mother said. "But remember, we need to leave by 5 for your science competition prep." "I won't forget," Zoe promised before running off to join the group of teens gathered near the basketball court. "How's the science project coming along?" Thomas asked. "They qualified for the state competition," Diane said proudly. "The quantum computing model impressed the judges." "That's wonderful," Thomas replied, though not surprising given how smart she is. Diane smiled, accepting the compliment to her daughter. Their relationship had evolved from that tense first meeting to something resembling friendship. Not close, but respectful and genuine. "I wanted to tell you," Diane said, lowering her voice slightly. "The community policing initiative we discussed is getting federal funding. The pilot program will include Oak Hills, Maple Street, and 3 other neighborhoods." Thomas nodded, genuinely pleased. After the forum, he'd joined a committee Diane had formed to improve relations between neighborhoods and law enforcement. His perspective as someone who had misused police resources had proven valuable. "That's great news," he said. "When do we start?" "Next month," Diane replied. "We'll need volunteers for the joint neighborhood walks." "Count me in," Thomas said without hesitation. Beth appeared with plates of food for everyone. The kids are having a great time, she reported, nodding toward the field where children from different neighborhoods played together without any visible divisions. That's how it should be, Diane's mother commented. When I was growing up, we knew all our neighbors for blocks around. Somewhere along the way, people started closing themselves off. Thomas knew she was right. His own parents had known everyone on their street, regularly sharing meals and watching out for each other's children. Somehow, his generation had lost that connection, replacing it with security systems and neighborhood watch apps that often fostered fear rather than community. As the afternoon progressed, Thomas found himself moving between different groups, introducing neighbors who had lived mere blocks from each other for years without ever meeting. The initial awkwardness gradually gave way to genuine conversations, discoveries of shared interests, and even plans for future get-togethers. Near the playground, he overheard two women exchanging phone numbers after learning their children attended the same school. By the basketball court, a man from Maple Street was deep in conversation with an Oak Hills resident about starting a community garden in the vacant lot between their neighborhoods. Small connections were forming everywhere he looked. As the event began winding down, Thomas found himself standing with Beth, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You did good," she said, slipping her arm through his. "We all did," he corrected. "It was a group effort." "True," Beth acknowledged. "But it might not have happened if you hadn't been willing to learn from what happened with Zoe." Thomas considered this. He wasn't proud of his actions that day, but he had come to recognize that moment as a turning point, not just for him personally, but potentially for the entire community. "Mr. Wilson," Zoe called, approaching with her group of friends. "We're collecting email addresses for the cross-neighborhood cleanup next weekend. Can we put you down as a volunteer?" "Absolutely," Thomas replied. "What area are we tackling?" "The creek between Oak Hills and Maple Street," one of the other teens explained. "We're going to clean it up and maybe start planning that nature trail everyone's been talking about. The one that would connect all 5 neighborhoods?" Thomas asked. "That's ambitious. We figured if we could get adults from every neighborhood working on it together, it might actually happen," Zoe said with a shrug. "Mom says the best way to break down barriers is to build something together." Thomas smiled, recognizing Diane's wisdom in her daughter's words. "Your mom is a smart woman." "She is," Zoe agreed. "She also says people can surprise you if you give them the chance." The comment caught Thomas off guard. He wondered if Zoe knew how much her forgiveness had meant to him, how it had opened the door to all the changes that followed. "Sometimes it takes someone giving you a second chance to become a better version of yourself," he said quietly. Zoe nodded, seeming to understand the weight behind his words. "That's what community is supposed to be about, right? Not just living near each other, but looking out for each other. Even when we mess up. Especially when we mess up," Thomas added. As the cleanup crew continued collecting names, Thomas looked around at the diverse group of people who had come together in a park that, just months ago, had felt like it belonged exclusively to Oak Hills residents. Children played without regard for which street they lived on. Adults exchanged contact information and made plans. Officer Reynolds chatted with a group of teens about their ideas for improving the community. The invisible lines between neighborhoods hadn't disappeared entirely. Such changes didn't happen overnight, but they had begun to blur. And in that blurring, Thomas could see the outline of something better taking shape. Not separate neighborhoods existing side by side, but a true community where everyone belonged. It had started with a mistake, with a moment when his worst instincts had taken over, but it had evolved into something he never could have anticipated. A chance to rebuild connections that had been broken long before he'd called the police on a teenage girl walking through his neighborhood. As the sun set on the first cross-neighborhood cookout, Thomas made a silent promise to himself. This was just the beginning.